Chapter 12 of Blacker Chief Dick. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Blacker Chief Dick by Margery Allingham. Chapter 12. It was 7 o'clock on the following Wednesday evening, and there was an air of expectation in the ship's kitchen. The Cold Light was due to sail under a new name at the late tide. Annie was upstairs preparing herself for Dick's coming, while in the room below the talk ran high, and many conjectures as to the captain's intentions were put forward and withdrawn as the company drank round the fire. "Osh! Where's the man as can withstand a pretty lass?" said Gilbot, smiling and hiccuping over his sack. "Ah, maybe. But 'tis a wonderful risky thing, this changin' names o' crafts," put in Granger, wagging his head. "I don't hold with it myself." "Ah, I reckon the captain knows what he's about. There ain't many like him to a mile," remarked another man. "You're right there," said old Siptimosit, who had been sitting silently in a corner for some time. "He ain't no crab, but I'd not let a lass of mine have much to do with him." "What do you mean?" said Hal, firing up and coming over from the doorway where he had been standing. Old Gilbot began to laugh. "Hark to the lad," he gurgled. "One would think he loved her hisself." Hal turned away from the light before he spoke. No one saw the deep flush which crept up over his features, even to the roots of his hair, making his scalp tingle uncomfortably. "We look after our wenches at the ship, Master Gilbot," he said hastily. Gilbot nodded happily. "Aye," he said, "wesh do," and the talk continued. Just as the clock by the chimney piece struck the quarter, steps were heard coming across the yard, and Blacker Chief Dick, flanked by Blue Neck and Habakkuk Coot, and backed by some 9 or 10 hardy ruffians, marched in at the door. In an instant the little Spaniard was the center of an enthusiastic group, for since his first coming to the ship, Dick had done much to make himself popular, and now his deep musical voice was raised good-naturedly above the din, calling for rum all round, and sack for those who wished for it. Hal and Sue darted about in obedience to his order, and soon the company stood, silent, mugs in hand, waiting for the toast. At this moment the inner door opened, and Annie, dressed in the purple gown that Sue had given her, stepped into the kitchen. Dick was at her side in a moment, and respectfully taking her hand, led her into the center of the room. "Anne of the Island, her health and beauty forever," he shouted, his tankard high above his head. The toast was given boisterously, and Annie blushed and smiled shyly. Old Gilbot was enjoying himself thoroughly, and took advantage of a lull in the conversation to exclaim, "Let's have a song," and then without any more ado began to quaver Pretty Poll at the top of his voice. The company took up the burden, and the final "Lost in the Rolling Sea" was bellowed till the rafters shook. "More rum!" called Dick, and then, as though obeying an impulse of the moment, he sprang upon one of the forms, and resting one foot on the trestled table, exclaimed, "Hark, ye dogs, here's a new song, mine own song, a song of Dick DeFazio's own composing." And then, throwing back his head, he began to sing in a remarkably true tenor voice, swaying his body in tune to his own music. "Fair as a seagull and proud as the sea, as naught in the world is fair Annie to me. So gentle, so tender, so wise without guile. Oh, where is another like Anne of the Isle? Anne, oh, Anne of the Isle, where is another like Anne of the Isle?" By this time the rumkins were all replenished, and the chorus of the song was taken up and repeated to the accompaniment of jingling pewter. Dick still kept his position and took up the song again, his dark eyes flashing and smiling at the girl, who watched him, fascinated. Avaunt, ye fine ladies of France and of Spain, so wayward, so wanton, so proud, and so vain. No sweet pleading look, no trick or no wile, shall ever more tempt me from Anne of the Isle. Anne, oh, Anne of the Island, where is another like Anne of the Isle? And then he added, before anyone could speak, To the brig, dogs! And skipping lightly off the table, he offered his hand to Annie, and led the way out into the yard, the whole company following, roaring as they went. Anne, oh, Anne of the Island, where is another like Anne of the Isle? Annie looked up shyly at the Spaniard, her heart beating quickly with excitement. He was strolling jauntily along, her hand lightly held in his own. The starlight touched the jeweled hilt of his knife, and his big, mournful black eyes winked and smiled happily. He loved display, pageant, parade. She could see that by the way his men marched around him in regulated order, and by his gorgeous clothes, and she herself became a little intoxicated by the air of excitement and the singing of the laughing, jostling crowd. Glancing at him under her lashes, she slipped her hand through his arm and laughed a little self-consciously. A curious, self-satisfied, but half-regretful smile passed over his face, and he bent toward her. "Give me a kiss, little one," he said softly. A wave of cold water seemed to dash over Annie's pleasure, and she drew her arm away stiffly, saying, "Prithee, sir, I would return to the ship." Again the curious smile spread over Dick's lips, but this time there was no regret. "Pardon, mistress, methinks thy beauty and mine own singing hath made my brain whirl. Prithee, fair one, give me thy hand again." Annie looked at him and held out her hand without a word. He seemed so debonair, so gracious, such a fine gentleman, and his soft eyes sought hers almost beseechingly, she thought. "Anne, oh, Anne of the Island, where is another like Anne of the Isle?" sang the company as the little procession neared the waterside. Sue, who walked between French and Siptimoset, looked at the two small figures and sighed involuntarily. She also thought the Spaniard was a fine gentleman, and she also had seen his dark eyes fixed mournfully on the other girl's face, and she began to laugh and talk noisily to hide her vexation. Gallantly, Blacker-Chief Dick led the little serving wench down over the planked way to the rowboat, helped her in, and then stepped lightly after her. Several of the company crowded in behind them, and they pushed off. The rest of the band seized other boats that were anchored near the shore, and followed as best they could. Once on board the brig, Annie looked about her with delight. The shrouded sails and the spider-like rigging pleased her immensely. The swinging lanterns overhead showed the clean boards and newly painted sides, and she laughed with satisfaction as she noticed first one thing and then another. Dick was no less pleased. He loved his boat and derived more pleasure from showing it off than from anything else in the world. He took her from end to end, telling her tales of hair-breadth escapes and secret cargoes of papers and documents. Indeed, carried away by his own enthusiasm, he even hinted that good King Charles owed more to Dick de Fasio's courage than His Majesty was aware of. Annie listened to him open-mouthed as he talked on, embroidering his tales with a network of fine and polished phrases, and interrupting them here and there to shout an order or swear at an unhandy sailor as the man hurried to obey him. When at last the greater part of the company, which had followed Dick from the ship, stood on the deck of the Coal Light, he opened the proceedings after the custom of the island by calling for rum all round. After the toast, the whole crowd, which was by this time very boisterous, congregated in the forepart of the ship to inspect the figurehead, which was at the moment covered with a piece of sailcloth. Dick, with his inborn love of dramatic effect, had seen to this, and now, stepping forward, he whipped it off with a flourish and stepped back, observing with delight the impression it was making. Old Ned Hutton, the ship's carpenter, was certainly not an artist, but he had done his best, and all that paint and a chunk of rough-hewn wood could do had been done. The figure was undoubtedly meant to represent Annie, and that was enough for mercy folk. Everybody cheered loudly, and Dick called for more rum. Then he and the girl went forward to examine the figurehead more closely. The ugly, awkward thing was profusely decorated with gold paint. So much Annie could see by the light of the lantern which Dick gallantly held for her. And her name, Annie, was painted on the bright blue band that went round the figure's black head. "'Tis lovely," she whispered half to herself, as she ran her fingers over the great arms and breasts on which the paint was hardly dry. Dick smiled and made her the obvious compliment, and they went down to the bows and leaned over the gunwale so as to see the 4 great white letters, Annie, painted on the smooth brown sides. The girl was delighted, and her infectious gurgling laugh rang out clearly several times on the cold air as she listened to Dick's sparkling conversation. "Tide's full and wind fair," sang out a voice suddenly from the watchtower. Instantly there was confusion. Dick shouted orders here and there, but did not take his hand from Annie's arm. Everyone made for the boats, shouting farewells to the crew, which responded cheerfully. Dick bent nearer to the girl. "I will come again," he said softly. Annie smiled and nodded. "We are ever pleased to see company at the ship," she said demurely, slipping her arm out of his grasp and moving over to the side where French, Sue, and Hal waited for her. Dick followed her. "Give us your blessing, mistress," he said loudly. There was silence at once. The sailors attached much importance to a blessing, and they stood quietly. Annie looked round desperately. She had never had a blessing in her life, much less given one, and for a moment she was entirely at a loss. No one spoke, however, so at last she crossed herself devoutly and said as clearly as her nervousness would permit, "I pray God bless this ship. Amen." "Amen," repeated the crew solemnly, and then dashed off on their business, and the bustle recommenced. Sue climbed over the side of the boat. French followed her, and then Hal. "Farewell, Anne of the Island," said the Spaniard softly. "I will return to thee." Annie looked at him, and he seemed to her very comely. She held out her hand, and he raised it to his lips. "Farewell, sir," she said, and then followed her lover into the little boat. "Farewell," came the deep and almost beautiful voice again. There was the clink of chains, and the anchor was weighed, and then the brig, her sails all set, glided out into the channel. Hal bent his back to the oar he was plying, and spoke to the other 3 in the little rowboat without looking up. "There goes a damned nuisance off the Isle for a bit," he said. French grunted and pulled hard. Sue sighed and looked out to sea, while Annie laughed a little ruefully and patted Hal's broad shoulders with her little brown hand. End of chapter 12. Recording by John Brandon.